Alex, welcome back. So the last time we spoke to you was not a great time for you. It
Yeah,
was just after the was it a tropical cyclone? I always like the
that's
names
right.
of different storms. You're like, is it a typhoon? Is it a hurricane? Who knows? But that
Yeah,
was in Timor-Leste. So how are you?
I'm good. I'm now in Portugal, and spent a lot of time this year learning from that experience and kind of taking direction from it. It was a powerful time. Because I didn't listen to the podcast until quite a while after I recorded it. I'd kind of forgotten about how the state that I was in when I spoke to Ruxi. So yeah, but it was I think hearing the experience again afterwards really reminded me of what I needed to do in response to that for myself and for other people and for, you know, being more aware of what the climate can do, you know. So,
Yeah. I often think sometimes, and seeing and hearing from people at COP has really sort of doubled down the impression that I have that a lot of people involved in the climate movement don't have any real perspective on what tragedy on that scale really looks like. And I wonder sometimes if the hesitation that people have towards sort of climate adaptation measures and kind of moving those along like really fast, if some of that is just that people don't quite understand how terrifying, how helpless you could feel in those situations.
well, it was one of the points that Ruxi and I spoke about back then. And then I remember when there was the flooding in Germany in the summer.
Yeah.
We were both kind of thinking, oh, now it's actually happening. I wonder, were there people talking about that recent event in COP, from, Europeans?
Not so much at COP, but it certainly was. It featured quite heavily on the news here, probably more so even than something like what's been happening in California or what happened in Cape Town with the water crisis, or any number of the places that have been badly hit. It certainly featured more heavily in the news here than anything like that. I think it was quite shocking for people really to just kind of see like, oh, this can even happen in Europe, you know?
Mm, mm.
So,
Yeah, I mean, Australians already kind of had regular exposure to these things through bushfires, and we had the really bad
of
fires
course,
in
yes.
2019 and
I knew I
2020.
was missing another big one. It was of course it was the fires. Oh, those were wild. I
But
mean,
in a way, like we really displayed our ability to forget about these things so quickly as well. It's like,
yeah.
especially I think because we had, Australia is known for these kind of events, it just got in the political debate that happened afterwards, it just got pushed off as, oh, well, it's one extreme example, but it's nothing new. So, um, yeah, but it's I still I'm it's a kind of a sad thing to say that I'm glad that more and more people are seeing the direct effects of it, because that I do think that that will push people to action.
Yeah, for sure. So, the topic of today, actually, of today's stream, unfortunately, Rux isn't able to join us this evening to keep us on the straight and narrow. So, Alex and I, who love a good tangent, are going to attempt to keep this moving along. So, the topic actually for today's live stream is, well, climate, I guess, climate action, climate change, climate crisis, climate emergency, whatever you want to call it, and mental health. So we had spoken about this, I think, with you, Alex, prior to even COP. Um, but then COP rolled around, and we were all just, anybody who knows or wanted to know anything about COP, you probably went and like signed up for all the virtual events because that was quite exciting. And then it just ended up being this overload of content coming at you 24/7 on every news channel about COP, about climate change, about how disappointed we are. And it's all just become quite a lot, I think. And so we wanted to do the stream and just kind of talk a little bit about, I guess, ways that we find is, helping us cope with these things. Um, and Alex, certainly you bring a different perspective to what Rux and I obviously obviously think about it. So thanks for joining us.
All right,
Um,
thanks for having me.
so I guess mental health and climate change, much the same as if you care about any social issue, I guess it can become quite overwhelming. So, I mean, what is your perspective on the challenge? Like, how do you experience this?
I was in preparing for this podcast, I remembered a moment that I'd had when I was about 21 or so, I think. And it was kind of a moment where my realizations or my expectations about the way the world would be in my lifetime, or the way I thought it would be, it really were shocked. And I'd grown up reading, like as an Australian, reading about very recent history, 150, 200 years prior, of explorations of a part of the world that seemed completely wild and unspoilt. There was the journals of um, British explorers in the South Pacific talking about rowing into um, the shoals of Pacific Islands and there being so many fish in the sea that they were jumping out of the sea and into the
Yeah.
boats. And I saw this documentary, I can't remember the name of it. It was about some of the biggest mammals on the planet, and they were doing dissections of them or autopsies on them. And they found a polar bear which had died, and they did an autopsy on it, and they found that it was a hermaphrodite. And they started to say that they'd been finding more and more hermaphroditic polar bears um, because the toxins that get passed up through the food chain were disrupting their hormones so much that they were no longer becoming clearly male or female.
Whoa.
And like those
It's
toxins are
pretty
like
crazy.
the heavy metals that we talk about being in salmon and those sort of things that we eat get collected in the fat. And of course, the bears love the fat and they go up through the seals, and so they get the highest concentrations of them. And that was when I realized it's like, wow, there's no level of the ecosystems, of the planet that we haven't affected and changed. And that
Mhm.
I remember I was quite like disturbed by that pervasive damage that we'd done back then. And that was for me like a point where I kind of had to readjust my understanding of just how pure or pristine the world was, and it's still an ongoing process of like understanding what we've done to the world since then.
Mm.
So
It's a very powerful point. I really like hiking. I do a lot of it wherever I am. And I often think about how uh, you wouldn't really run around outside anymore without shoes on, would you? Because you'd be scared. I'm always like, I'm going to step in some glass, or I can't just wouldn't just go walk through a river barefoot because I might, I don't know, stab myself on some heroin needle or something crazy. But it really is. It feels like we really have kind of gotten to a point where we've irreversibly screwed it all up, and obviously we know now that we have. um, I think the part to my mind, essentially, I think there's potentially two issues. The one is needing to um, this very controversially. I kind of think we need to start. I think moving forward with the idea that bad things are coming. When we spoke before, you mentioned this point, and we can kind of go into it a bit later. Um, And I think the other is also just, being able to speak about it, to be able to talk about it with your friends, and to kind of understand, I think, what is kind of hype and what is told to us in, some very dramatic terms, I think sometimes. Um, you know, and being able to just sort of, I guess, like release that sort of anxiety about it, being able to ask the right questions, getting the right info from your news. So I think there's a literacy part about it. But given that we're not going to solve that, I think, in
I
like
think
one go.
there are some other big points which I think it's good for people to be aware of at the beginning, which are balancing to the doom
Mhm.
and gloom in a sense. And they come from some of the things I'd like to touch on as we get into it, particularly from indigenous experiences of and relationships to nature. In Australia, there's been a big debate in the last 20 years about just how much Indigenous Aboriginals controlled the landscapes in Australia, and whether this idea that the nature was actually pure is real or not, or whether we
Mm.
Europeans discovered a land that was already influenced by and highly controlled by human activity. And I think whether or not whatever the real story is, the lesson is that we have, as humans, have always been in relationship with nature in a very powerful, influential position. And um, I mean, it was before it was a more balanced position where, we could still be hunted and killed by other elements of nature that we didn't have control over. Um, but we have always had the ability to be custodians in a sense.
Mm.
And that's the real kind of relationship that we need to move back to. Um, and we should probably have like a reading list for things that we reference at the end of this, because there's a lot of books that I've read over time which I think are really
Mm.
cool to tell people about, and they can go and find their own inspiration from it. So,
Yeah. Well, if you drop them in the chat, Alex, as we go through that, or we can collate them at the end, we will put them on our website, which should be linked somewhere around what you're seeing right now. So, how did you find COP? Were you watching any of the virtual sessions? Were you like fully immersed? What? How did
um,
that go?
I had I learned my lesson about these sort of things a while ago.
Why didn't you warn us?
Well, as an Australian, I've got a long history of being disappointed by our leaders in regards to climate
Mhm.
change. So, I knew that our politicians were going there to be as weaselly as possible in doing
Yep.
very little. Actually, like as soon as it ended, several of the coalition government ministers ministers and parliamentarians started saying, "This is great news. We can build more coal mines." They didn't, and like it's just completely missing the point. And so I was very cynical about it to start. And
Yeah.
I also guess that like I'm in terms of like my expectations of what our political systems are capable of, I'd already resigned myself to the fact that it could quite possibly be very disappointing. Um,
So
so
that's, I
yeah.
mean, that's a really interesting point, because I've been thinking the last couple of weeks, like, am I ever going to get excited about another COP? And I feel like the answer is absolutely not. Like, I think there is so much hype around this one, maybe because we waited the additional year, and now it was going to be virtual, and like the world has moved on so much in 2 years and all of that kind of stuff. But maybe that's essentially where we will all end up, and then we kind of you have to evaluate whatever your contribution to this movement will be, and you're just like, what's the fucking point? Because I think the sort of the biggest thing in terms of my mental health that I find with the climate movement is that it's really isolating. It's isolating being an activist, especially if you aren't, I think it's different for people who kind of exist within the movements. Maybe they're part of, Fridays for Future, or they work for an NGO or something like that. But when you're just kind of out in the world, most of the people you know don't give a shit.
Mm,
Not enough to kind of to do very much about it. You know, they might be like a casual recycler. You know, maybe they might be interested in getting like a hybrid car. You know, they'll pay the emissions offset when they book a flight. You know,
mm.
they're just sort of chill people. Um, and I find that quite difficult. I mean,
That's a great point in terms of like where the rubber hits the road in anxiety about these things as a mental health phenomena.
mm,
Because, and I remember when I started to notice these things coming up in myself, it was a feeling of this is a really, really important thing that's affecting everybody, and you all need to pay as much attention to this as I feel right now. And and you kind of you can start to feel like a burden on other people for caring about it, or as if you're being too negative all the time, and it's
you're always
fine.
that person.
Yeah, yeah, and finding uh, a way to express it and to feel like you are connecting with people and being heard is like what I think we want to try and find some tips on throughout this conversation, because that is, yeah, it's it's very overwhelming to feel like you're the only, or you're just one little person in this sea of people who don't care that much or are not aware of it that much.
Mm. I mean, equally so, I think there's another part of it, and probably after COP, kind of feeling. So after COP, I was feeling very overwhelmed. You know, I haven't really mentioned it sort of on the podcast, but I am also studying, and I am studying climate policy. So like my whole life is pretty much talking about climate change all the time, and it's kind of the work that I do. People ask me about it because they know I'm studying about it. We have the podcast about it. We talk about it constantly. And after COP, I was like, I've hit this wall, absolutely no further. I can't do this.
Mm,
I'd followed as much as many accounts as I could on all of my social platforms to try and make sure that I didn't miss news about it. And the single one only thing that I just wanted to do was, and it didn't even take me to the end of COP. It was like halfway through where I was like, enough. I don't want to see it. I don't want to hear about it. I don't want to see the cute pictures on Instagram. I don't want to see the witty tweets. I want to see none of it. I am done. So for me, that would probably be like my first tip when it all just becomes a bit much. It's honestly just like everything else, right? Step away, go for a walk.
yeah,
Um,
well, it's also, I think, I had this experience in a previous period of life in relation to the war in Syria, where I was very deeply involved in following news about it and analyzing it and discussing it all the time. And at a certain point, I switched off, partly because I didn't want my life to be dominated by arguments and that kind of negativity, but also because there's a point where the daily updates, the hourly updates, all the tiny little pieces of detailed information don't make that much of a difference anymore. Like we
mm,
know the climate is going in a certain direction. Reading, 100 articles a week about COP26 isn't really going to fundamentally alter that direction in the next 12 months. So you can, in a sense, this kind of thing allows you to take a bit of space from it.
mm,
And all right, that's what's going on. I can give myself space from it in the immediate, you know, aggravating news cycle, and start to take action from a sort of a safer, more stable place.
mm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. In fact, it was very that was pretty much, I think, exactly what happened with all of the sessions that I signed up to watch during COP, where I was just like, I know what they're going to say. I don't need to watch that.
Mm,
Like, and
mm,
I think it's one of those. I mean, you just have to be ruthless with your time. But another point, obviously, that came up in our planning is this idea that like eco anxiety is not necessarily like a mental health condition. Would you care to elaborate?
Yeah, so I mean, I'd noticed this in terms of general discussions about mental health in the past, that there is some sort of cultural tendency, especially in the Western world, to think that any, like the disease model of mental health, I guess, is the way it's described as, like, there's no reason for you to have a mental health issue. So if you do, or if you feel any of these emotions, therefore there's something wrong with you and we need to fix that. Whereas, and I remember there was a particular, like, spokesperson about it on the radio one day saying, like, um, these are all treatable things and there's no reason to feel this way. And I thought, well, no, actually, like, if anybody who is interested in what's going on in the world in any kind of sector, whether it's the environment or economics or, like, labor exploitation through clothing or whatever, anywhere you look, you can find really bad phenomena going on. And the scale of those is big enough to make an individual feel powerless, to feel depressed, even to feel guilty about it, to feel shame about their role in it, um, and to feel anxious. So those kind of things are normal responses, especially anxiety, to, when you think about it, what is an almost existential threat. And, like, the
Yeah.
body responding in that way to threats is completely normal. Um, and I read some interesting points on, like, traumatic experiences in relationship to anxieties, and, like, when you have this overarching thing which affects all sort of planning and all sort of life decisions, like, there's a lot of people who talk about this in whether they're going or not they're going to have a kid these days, whether they're not they're going to have children.
Very true. Yeah.
These type of things start to cascade down through your thought patterns, and really seep into little moments of the day, like, will I buy, or no, these are not a small decision, but where you'll buy a house, for example, or where you choose to live. Will that be in a bushfire prone area? Will it be near a low-lying um, piece of land that could be underwater in 50 years? Like, those are the sorts of decisions that are starting to filter down into our considerations. So to be anxious about them is not abnormal at all.
I guess there's also a part of it too with the uncertainty around the future. Is it something that, like, a weird thing that worries me is the like uh, so I'm an economics student. I love a good graph. And one of the things that we do quite often is trying to estimate what the cost of climate change will be in terms of cost of living and overall GDP. And the thing that just really stresses me out is I'm just like, people aren't going to be afford to be able to keep themselves safe. Like, or if we put carbon taxes on everything, like, the cost of living is going to go way up and, like, people are going to starve. And I just get into such an absolute, like, frenzy over this one single thought, and it can get really intense, I think. And I think this is kind of what something you were saying earlier about that feeling, that individual responsibility, because ultimately too, that's what companies, that people want us to take responsibility for it so that they don't have to. So I think we've kind of, the culture within the climate movement has sort of reinforced this eco anxiety almost, because we're still telling people, reduce your own emissions, eat less meat, recycle your plastics,
Mm, mm. Well, that I think we'll circle back around this point quite a lot in terms
Mm,
of individualism, and the feeling of being an individual in this moment. Because, yeah, you're right, it's sold as a way out, as if consumer choice alone can have a big impact on this. And I just had a discussion with someone last night actually about how consumer choice is actually quite fake when you look at the economic situation of most people in the world, unless government regulations set a fair point from which consumers can make a choice than putting someone who, can barely afford to feed their family in a position of like maybe they want to buy organic food, for example.
Hmm.
It's completely unrealistic for them to be
Yeah.
in that position and expect them to take that responsibility. Um, so, but also the other big part in relation to anxiety is that feeling alone is su super, super important for all sorts of mental health challenges. Even if we're not talking about climate change, there's so much research that shows that people who are parts of a um, welcoming and tight-knit community where they have community and social support and where they feel a sense of place and purpose and belonging recover better from all sorts of traumatic experiences and deal with challenges and stresses better than we do when we're alone. And unfortunately, the people, societies that are causing the most damage are fundamentally individualistic societies where we're all put in a race against each other, essentially. So that's like a phenomenon that shadows over all of this in both in the way we experience anxiety and depression and other phenomena, but also in the way we respond to it.
I think it's pretty good mental health advice in general, about that. Don't isolate, lean on your community, things like that. And I think the difficulty often is like, how do I kind of translate this knowledge into like action every day? And yeah, I guess maybe that's like the difficult question then, is like how to create like a sense of community around yourself, not to be left in those sort of situations where you're feeling a bit down and vulnerable, basically, because we all go through those phases.
Yeah, and it can be hard. Like it's not easy to find community groups wherever you are. Also, I guess depending on where you are living in the world, levels of awareness can be different. Um, Cultural attitudes to the problem can be different. If you're living in a developing country, climate change is far lower down on the list of priorities on most people's minds than it is in, a privileged urban setting in a developed country. Um, so, I mean, one of the ways that I've been thinking about actual practical action this year is through municipal government, in the sense that that's kind of like a very locally accessible, or even lower, less than a municipal government, sort of community groups, which may not immediately have an interest in the climate, but everybody in different ways has an interest in the environment around us. And going and thinking about like how can the people around me benefit, or how are they going to be affected by this, and how can I show them that it's in their interest to think about changing their behaviors or changing their policies on something. Um,
And it
and
can be quite small, right? Like we're not talking like
Yeah,
about big projects. So I mean, an example that I just think it's fantastic. So I don't know if you've heard of the activist group here in the UK called Insulate Britain.
no,
Um, but their one single mission is just to get the UK government to force people to insulate their homes. That's all. Like it is super simple to this point. And what these folks do is they glue their hands to the roads in London and then obviously sit down so they can't be moved. But you know what? It's not so much the fact that they glue themselves to the road, which in my mind is extremely annoying. And like it is definitely the way that you want to go about that kind of
getting attention.
nonviolent. Yeah. Like, oh
Yeah,
man, people are pissed. Like people in London are like, throw him in jail. Like they may have a new ordinance passed because of them to not allow people to disturb traffic like that. But anyway, what was my point about insulate Britain? Oh, so something like that, right? So insulating your home. I mean, something that could make a huge difference is, what I think is if you approach like your community library and you were just like, okay, so the one singular goal of this is going to be to insulate the library. And it's like, it's a tiny little thing, like tiny thing. I mean, it's not that small, but it's a relatively small thing that could have an impact, not only on the community, but just overall the running of that building will be more efficient. They'll have more money to reinvest back into the community. Like it's a very sort of, I mean, I'm oversimplifying how that would work, but it's a very simple sort of small scale project. And I think there's a lot of power in trying to like put your effort into those sorts of things rather than like, how do I solve COP?
Mm. Well, even beyond the physical actions or making a physical change, one of the articles which we shared prior mentioned that there'd been a lot of studies on people who were suffering from what they labeled ego anxiety, and how they were engaging in discussion groups around it
Mm,
within their communities. And most of the people who had engaged in those groups felt, just from the talking and seeing that other people had similar human feelings and emotions from the same phenomena, they felt empowered as a group just from the sitting around and talking. And that is, takes very few resources. You could do it through a shared community space where you open up something like, it doesn't even have to be explicitly about mental health. You can do it quite subtly if there are cultural stigmas about mental health in your area, which is, quite common in some parts of the world. You could do it through a book discussion group, and you choose a book that talks about relationships in nature, or you can do it in this
or
sort
a
of ways,
film.
or a film, yeah, and bring it into people's minds and get people talking about it on a human level, and start to make incremental change from that way. Um,
And
and
there's online communities too, if, IRL is not your vibe.
Yeah, I think the online thing for me, I've kind of gone the the more technology advances, the more I'm just like, no, that's just enough for me.
Cheers.
But I think it's because the reality of taking action in your immediate space around you kind of starts to build the positive reinforcement mechanism, like in a very tangible way. And I think that is quite important for building up the positive, even like emotional momentum for people to feel like they can make a difference.
Mm.
In the online, I don't know, I haven't engaged in online activism enough, but I sense that it might be one of those things that can end up in like very superficial things like petitions which go nowhere, or everything on the internet seems to just disappear very quickly after it loses its moment in the sun.
Yeah,
And
but I mean, people could still connect to each other,
yeah, yeah,
form sort of
absolutely.
sub communities. Because I know one of the things certainly that I found when I went to live in the middle of nowhere in Spain was I was like, oh my God, I've just gone from London. Where are my people? They're not here. And it was, and I think, you kind of forget, obviously, like there are loads of people around the world who don't live in, progressive places, who don't necessarily have access to loads of information on this or to loads of people who know anything. So I think, I agree about the petitions. Man, I subscribe to one website to not be named, but they literally send me a new petition about the climate every day. And I started counting and I got to like 16 days or something like that, where they sent me a new climate petition every day. And I was like, what is this? This is what is this? Um, Anyway, so yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of value in online. I think, but as you say, I think, reaching out to people. And also, another perspective to consider on that topic is that sometimes the people around you, it's not that they don't want to talk about it, they just don't know enough about it to
Mm,
feel like they want to have, a conversation. So, something that I try and bridge all the time with my family, because, I'm South African, my family are not what you would describe as progressive necessarily, is just, try to almost feel out like what they know, like what do you know about this? Um, and sometimes I think people in your life will surprise you.
well, the environment is very good material for appealing to shared human interests, actually. And that's kind of a way that you can come at it from a different angle with people who might not agree with you about the climate crisis, that face value of it. If you can appeal to, your parents' memories of growing up and visiting this certain place where, they might have had a memory of the trees blooming at a certain time of the year, and that being such a beautiful experience to see that natural phenomenon and to show them, well, look, that's no longer accessible because of what's changing and what's happening. There's so many small examples that you can do with that when everybody has experiences of nature in that way. So it's really like what I think is quite important, um, again, from a mental health perspective, in trying to talk to people about it, is not being so combative
Oh,
because,
like so important.
yeah, and also not combative and judgmental, because just because people don't know or don't believe, like, don't have the same opinion as you, doesn't mean that they are dumber or evil. And I actually wrote down a bit about this before we started because one of the phenomena of trauma is that we people can become um, in denial of what happened to them and denial of the change that they experienced, or just denial of the experience itself. And um, as I mentioned earlier, like, coming to acceptance of change and acceptance of what is happening is a huge step in preparing ourselves mentally and emotionally and spiritually for difficulties to come. And I think you can see, like, denial of a phenomenon. We see it like climate denialism is one of the main ways we hear about this. We mostly hear about it in the sense of, like, it's just propagated by evil companies and self-interested politicians upon the uneducated, conspiracy theory believing masses who are, sucked into this. But
Antifa.
but the thing is, like, those these masses that we want to change the minds of, the people who might deny the change in climate, they're not doing it simply because they are just, that's like the way they like to think. There are always deeper reasons to the ways that people behave, and resistance to change is a human response to very
Yeah.
scary circumstances, and you know, you can see it in other political phenomena, like in the Brexit vote and in the election of Trump. The um, communities that were the most radicalized in those big sudden changes are clinging on to old values and very hardline beliefs because of the shocks that are going on in their immediate worlds. There's large
Yeah,
groups of
it's a
people who,
threat to their identity, essentially.
yeah,
Like,
yeah, large groups of people who no longer have secure jobs, and yeah, big elements related to their identity. And So yeah, like you're not going to ever change those people's minds by attacking them, and because that's just going to bring them more inwards and make them more defensive. Um, so I'm sure there's many people out there who have family members who they have these challenges with, and they need to think about empathetic ways to empathize with people, to have a human conversation with them rather than an argument.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that's very important. I think one of the, just as a comment, I guess, of like the politics for the last like 5, 6, 7 years, like it all kind of kicked off with Brexit and Trump, didn't it? But you know, I think social discourse around politics and about like all of these identity issues that we're all facing, right? Because it's all about moral grandstanding at the moment. Like,
Mm,
who's the best vegan? Who,
mm,
and regardless of what that is, that could be about like social media followers. That could be about whatever it is that you're finding value in. Um, and it's not helpful. Like, it's not helpful to try to be the best at. Someone shared an experience with me about the Fridays for Future March at COP, and basically how the activists had formed a sort of chain around a group of like Greta and her crew, basically, and like weren't speaking to anybody, weren't like trying to engage, literally wouldn't let anybody near like the front of the march, like just super like closing ranks around things. And
mm,
you kind of like look at things like that sometimes, and you're just like, it's so sad how human nature is so predictable in that way. When I was in South Africa and I was a student activist, we used to say all the freaking time, and no one in Europe says this, but like the phrase is absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? I believe it's a fairly well-known statement, but and I think like it's just that thing, like people will cling to the power that they have, they will cling to like not wanting to accept things are changing, and it's exactly what we've seen with the fossil fuel companies now. But I think the part of it that's on our side, and the part of it I think that gives me hope is that this isn't like this isn't like the pandemic. It's not like, the tobacco crisis, or somebody compared climate change to the tobacco crisis. And I was just like, what?
You
Like,
mean smoking as a
yeah,
public health
yeah. They were
crisis?
just like, so the energy transition needs to be similar to how they phased out tobacco. And I was
Mm,
like, no, that's not it at all. Like, and this is a very well respected academic in this space. And I was just like, who are you? Uh, anyway, but I completely forgot where I was going with this now. Alex, help me. What was I talking about?
um,
Completely got off the rails here. I
you
told you.
were about absolute power and the way
Oh, yeah, yeah,
the
yeah. Anyway,
combativeness of it.
yeah, and I think you kind of have to sometimes have empathy for people in these situations, because it's like it's people, I think, who lack self-awareness in that situation to understand why they have biases towards certain things. And unfortunately, I think that is often missing. So when we're looking at fossil fuel companies and we're like, the surface of it looks like, oh God, they won't just let go of the oil. I mean, the bottom line is that this is, a very carefully constructed corporation built on profit at any cost. So moving away from fossil fuels isn't just threatening one of their revenue lines, it is literally shaking the foundation of what that company was built on. And it exists in corporations, it exists in individuals.
Mm,
And I think when thinking about, I try when I'm communicating with people that I am finding particularly difficult, to try and always just think of like, this is where they're coming from. Their concern is, that their company is going to go out of business. Unfortunately, they didn't have a good answer about how to, respond to fossil fuel companies in that situation, because like, tough luck. But
Well, I'm glad that you're an economist actually, because I've been thinking so much more lately about how activists and people who want to make a better world in many different areas really need to understand the dry mechanics of economics a lot more, because whether we're talking about business decisions or individual actions, there's very few individual people in the world who, if you sat down with them over a table and talk to them, would they say that, yeah, I don't care about nature, I want to do whatever I want to it? There's very, very few people who would have that sort of attitude, you know? And then you start to understand, well, there's all these other circumstances that are going on in everybody's lives, which are driving us towards environmentally destructive actions. Not necessarily because we want to take them, but these are the set of choices that we find ourselves in. And so, like, one of the, going back to some practical recommendations that people can do to feel a bit more empowered. There's a big discussion in Australia at the moment about shifting investments out of, like, we have a compulsory retirement savings scheme, so everybody
Hmm.
puts 9% of their income into big, big savings funds, and they have the capacity to direct investments in huge areas, often in energy investments. So, like, if anybody listening wanted to do something to make a direct impact today, take your money out of unethical banks and savings funds and put them into ethical funds. And most funds show quite in detailed lists of where their money goes, and that actually does really change things. That hundreds of millions of dollars going into renewable energy production around the world is actually what is changing the dynamics of energy production, regardless of what the governments do. Because
Yeah.
the government's representing sort of interests that are clinging on to a losing business model. Renewable energy is already way cheaper in most parts of the world than fossil fuels, and it's just going to become more and more competitive. And this is a sign of positivity for people to look to as well.
I'm actually glad you say that because I feel like I generally come under fire for being a little bit too optimistic about what's coming up. Because I I think that the one thing that people miss sometimes when we look at like the future projections of what is coming, because as you said, like an important part of this is like we need to understand that this is happening. This isn't like the pandemic. This isn't going to just like go away after a while. Like this is coming, and even if we meet the Paris obligations, like the climate is still going to get warmer. Like it's coming. So, but the reality is also that humans were very good at adapting to our environment with like some well-placed investments and maybe a little bit more forthcoming from the global investment community as we've been constantly promised. Like we could actually be, I don't want to say like okay as in like it's all going to be fine because it's not, but like it's going to be maybe more fine than we think about it. We think it is. But that aside, I think the one place that you see a lot of positive change at the moment is around voluntary and mandatory disclosures of like ESG requirements in supply chains. So, to anybody listening, that might have sounded like a lot of jargon, but essentially, like companies are now putting standards in place for like their emissions reporting across their whole supply chain, including their indirect scope 3 emissions. Like, there is positive stuff there if you look for it. And I think it's important to also remember that.
Yeah, that reminds me of another uh, journalist troublemaker that I remember seeing in Australia a couple of years ago. Um, there's not just one individual, there's many people who do this. They become shareholders of companies
Yeah.
which have huge environmental footprints. And once you're a shareholder, you can go to board meetings and shareholder meetings and raise a voice about what the company is doing, its corporate social responsibility, commitments, all these sort of things, and push for change from within.
There's a really actually I think there are two episodes of the How to Save a Planet podcast that one of them talks about the how they did this within Amazon
Hmm.
and another about Exxon, the oil company. I don't know if that's Exxon Mobil. I think anyway, the oil company. Because there's also these sort of investor groups that are getting together to buy large chunks of shares on. Rux has just put in the chat. Yes, it was Exxon. I'm glad she is there. So just kind of keeping an eye on the time. We've got a few minutes left. So what haven't we covered, Alex? What?
Well, there's a big part of the kind of, I mean, going deeper into the mental health part of the real deep sort of spiritual area of our relationship to nature that I would love to talk about. But I do realize that we had
Tell
actually,
me.
with Ruxi, when we were talking about this had already spanned out into three podcasts. So so it's understandable if we don't cover it. But like I think in following on from the idea of accepting change in what's coming ahead is that um, we are seeing that our idea of being these sort of all-powerful beings over the earth and being able to use the resources however we want to push ourselves into material bliss is no longer a reality, or that it was always a fantasy, more accurately. And that and I think I was really hoping, and I think there is still hope, that COVID might have kind of provided a break for people to reconsider our relationship to resources in this way, in the sense that we as individuals in the broad span of time, our egos, our career pursuits, our possessions and our material desires and all this stuff that we let pull us through the consumerist world on a daily basis, they're not that important, really. And it also, if for the people that are really, really worried about the environment, they're so unimportant that in the worst possible scenario, we all wipe ourselves out. The planet will still continue on where we are that unimportant, and nature will over time find a way to re regrow. Um, And so, that is really, really going back to a very strange idea of relationship to us as relationship to the natural world for Western minds. But for indigenous minds, our insignificance in the broad span of time and within the power of the planet is not that strange. Um, and that last point about, us, no matter what we do, we can fuck it up as much as we want, and nature will regrow. Is a bit I think it can be a bit dangerous because it can also encourage people to do nothing and just think, oh,
Sure.
it's yeah, and um,
Not
yeah.
how we meant it, guys.
For those people, I would just like to think again, that's well, think about how your grandchildren will think about you if that's what they know you did. But um, yeah, really radically reassessing our relationship to nature um, has to be a part of this. And
Yeah.
yeah,
It's
and
it's a really interesting point. I think one of our other podcast guests had kind of made she she told, I'm trying to think of exactly, I don't want to misquote her, but basically it was something along the lines of like when the plague swept through Europe, so began like a disconnect from nature. Just kind of inherently moving away from kind of what had predated that, which was more of like a sort of paganistic type culture. And that it sort of evolved and evolved and evolved to a point where obviously now we're seeing, because I mean, like, really, when we're talking about the bad guys, right, we're really talking about extractive industries, right? Like, that's sort of, we're digging up half of Africa and then shipping it to the rest of the world.
mm,
Um, and it's that kind of thing. So, I think the interesting thing, and the part of the climate movement that made me really motivated to kind of go, okay, I'm fully dedicated to this now, is I feel as if we are building a new world order, which is about reassessing our relationship with nature and just kind of because it changes everything, doesn't it? Like it changes the fact that we can't rely on fossil fuels, which in itself is going to be a huge, huge thing for because it will change literally all the technology that we use. It will change all of the products that we use and kind of the basis of those products. And I think that there is something inherently quite exciting about that. Um, because what lies on the other end, as far as I'm concerned, is something where we really appreciate nature instead of just obviously, trying to take what we can from it. And I think that that will socially cause a lot greater cohesion, I think, between people and hopefully less desire to fight with each other constantly and threaten each other with nuclear warheads, hopefully.
Well, that's the getting, closer to what I'm seeing as the fundamental difference in the way societies do things is, we and the some of the links that I'll put into the show notes are really good at describing this, is that we live in a colonial mindset still. The way Western society behaves towards the environment and towards each other even actually is in a colonial mindset. We are actually broken down into individual colonial um, actors
So
in
we need that meme from Step Brothers where he's like, "Oh my God, did we just become best friends?" Because like I'm literally always the person who's like, "This is neo-colonialism. I will not stand for it."
but
So
it's funny, like if you think about it, the way we are encouraged as individuals to compete against each other to
yeah.
accumulate resources is to
It's
go
funny
out.
when you describe it like that, like, "Oh,
Yeah,
I'm accumulating my resources," because that's exactly what it is.
yeah, and so that has to be changed in a way that um, we can't go on thinking that we are able to dominate, to to be hungry all the time for more. Like, and that's the difference that you see in indigenous societies as opposed to Western European society, which is now expanded everywhere, is that indigenous societies came to a sort of stasis relationship with nature, which is full of shared communal responsibility for each other and for their circumstances. It's full of gratitude and spirituality in why they're there and what they're doing, as opposed to our societies, which is like go out there, be as successful as possible, make as much money as possible, the all of the sort of fundamental factors of life that allow you to do that, water and land and food and all those sort of things, just take them for granted. Don't ever
Mm.
think twice about them. And then on top of it, have no spiritual connection with the people around you or the ecosystems that support life. And so, I found that, like, for me, seeing the proliferation of plastics in the ocean as a surfer and someone who spends a lot of time in the sea is always really tough. Like, I can sit on the sand and look at the high tide mark and realize that it's all full of plastic. It's all full of tiny bits of plastic.
Yes.
And um, that those kind of moments are the moments when you are encouraged to develop a kind of a spirituality that is accepting of your small, tiny place within things, but full of gratitude.
Mm.
Um, so, I mean, we haven't, we should have mentioned it earlier, but like meditation and, non-prescriptive forms of spirituality are accessible to everybody, and
Mm.
they can lead you to a lot of new realizations, new pathways forward, when dealing with, challenging situations of anxiety and depression. And they really shouldn't be underestimated.
I think meditation is certainly is a very interesting thing. So I have ADHD, so meditation for me has always been like this thing where I'm like, oh, I wanna, but I think generally there is literally a meditation for everyone. If like me, like your brain is all over the place, like a guided meditation where you have something active to focus on, will really, really helpful. So and because it's the first thing people say, right? Where you're like meditation, they're like, I couldn't quiet my mind if I tried. And you're like, you can, you just don't know how. So, I think definitely like meditation is such a useful thing. And for people who are religious, prayer is not a different concept. It's a
Mm.
time that you have to kind of send some sort of mental energy somewhere. Meditation is a similar kind of vibe. So as you say, like I'm a firm believer that even just like sitting down and thinking about something for a little while is quite helpful. Um, and I think obviously, as you mentioned, it's regular anxiety management techniques work pretty well. So if it's disconnecting, then that's one thing. If it's meditation, it's another. Exercise. And I think ultimately remembering that no matter how much work you put in, you can't stop climate change in one day. So just like tranquilo and like, recharge, look after yourself. And you know
Yeah, I got COVID in June this year, and I was it wasn't long after the experience in Timor, and I was really like, Jesus Christ, nothing's gonna go right, like, and
2020 was like hold my drink.
yeah, and I got to a point where I felt like I was losing on all fronts, and I found that a way out in feeling a bit empowered in front of all these challenges was to set very small goals in what I could do to feel accomplished for the day, and just resetting them every day. It even got to the point where it's like, I'm going to lie on the floor in the sun all day. And when I stand up, picking myself up off the floor, literally and metaphorically, is my achievement for the day.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's a lot of people out there who feel like they're just not able to change anything and not achieving anything in relation to the climate or their personal lives. And as we know, these things, in mental health issues, these things all blend in together. But setting yourself very small targets and patting yourself on the back for meeting them is hugely powerful in reversing the kind of downward spiral that can come from these kind of pressures.
Yeah. And I think again, I think that's just so relevant. I think the problem with anxiety sometimes, regardless of what causes it, is that it sort of builds upon itself. So you really can't dig yourself into these terrible holes sometimes. Like it's crazy the stuff that your mind can do to you, really. Like, and it's not necessarily just only like anxiety about the future. It could also just be, becoming overwhelmed. Like I think with COP, it wasn't necessarily anxiety, it was just an overwhelming amount of information constantly coming at you. And some people handle pressure better than others. And sometimes it does, you just have to kind of take a step back, whatever that means. Making sure on my to-do list, it was always like just make sure that you shower and brush your teeth. And if I did those two things in a day, I was like, it's cool, I'm winning. Because it does get a lot sometimes, and as you say, funny enough, life always has that tendency to do more than one thing at a time.
Mm.
um
And there's something like as we spoke about at the beginning in terms of like the surface noise of the news or whatever it is that's stressing you out. There's a big difference in taking action that is making actions that are reactive to those stresses
mm,
and sort of taking a step back from them and thinking about in the long term making a resolve to a course of action, to commit to a course of action. And that deeper resolve and distance from the, reactive stresses can give you um, much more stable place to move through all the little ups and downs that are going to come along the way. And I think in this type of long battle of trying to look after the planet, that's a really important mental health lesson for people to take. And meditation encourages that as well, to be less reactive to things, of course. So.
I think it's like moving, well, I don't know if it's moving forward, but I think like in the long run, I think you generally kind of have to look at these practices. You have to sort of practice consistency with them, which is a bit of a challenge. But I think like I don't know if you would call it necessarily the anxiety that you have around these, but I mean, like you could potentially also, start looking at some of those community practices that we were speaking about in the beginning. And also, I mean, like it's really about a combination of practices. Sorry, that's where I was actually getting with this very long-winded point. It's a combination of practices that you're kind of looking at. So it can be like the meditation, it can be taking action if that's available to you. It can be like reaching out through your community. It might be sort of seeking advice. I think a lot of people are looking for somebody to tell them, like, how bad is this going to be? Like, how worried should I be about this? You know? And I think, for the most part, it's really difficult to try and disseminate the news. So I think like your point about like, making sure not everything that you read in a day is really going to make a difference. So really like being quite selective about the news sources that you also choose, and making sure that you don't, I guess, oversubscribe to things which present the information in a certain way, because a lot of publications obviously do that. And I think kind of my biggest lesson is really like stop being anxious that you can't remove every piece of plastic from your daily life, or that that you're going to take a flight. Like I'm taking a short haul flight in a week and I'm just like, I'm actually done feeling terrible about this. Like, and I feel like everybody needs to be released from that, because that for me is probably like the thing that's stressing most people out. They're like, oh God, if I don't recycle that bottle, what are my neighbors going to think?
Mm.
Like, it's not the end of the world. It's not really like, I'm not saying don't do it, but like, it's not the thing that's going to define whether or not the planet survives.
Yeah, I remember I lived in a attempt at a plastic-free household in Beirut many
Oh,
years
good.
ago, and I was having an argument with my flatmate at like 3 a.m. one day, and I was really stressed out. And I took a piece of chewing gum, and I was chewing some gum, and she's like, that's got plastic in it. And I was just like, I can't,
No!
I don't care anymore. This is not, I'm allowed to eat this piece of plastic.
Oh my God.
It was too many little details to pay attention to.
And it
Um,
literally it stresses people out.
yeah.
Like I feel like it stresses people out too. Or like how many people apologize that they eat beef these days? Because let me tell you, in the UK, people do not need an excuse to apologize about something random. But like they apologize for eating meat. They're like, oh,
Mm.
probably shouldn't the planet. Like it's okay. Eat your hamburger, you're fine. Um,
Well, so there's something which I think this discussion like that we're trying to do is obviously very different for different audiences.
mm,
Like audiences in like people in developing countries have, as we said, like a whole bunch of different priorities in their immediate worry lists of things to think about, and also people with different types of experiences with climate change have a whole bunch of different experiences to think about, like people who've been through bushfires and floods, and um, they can also have like very serious mental health responses to what they like traumatic responses. Um, and what I've come to understand, and the traumatization can also happen on a sense of a long-term chronic basis. It's not just
Mm.
in relation to um, an acute event. And I was started to draw lines between, you'll like this as an economist, but it might be a bit hard for everybody to understand, but to draw lines between what happens in traumatized people who become disembodied, which is a very common thing, like, and that's why physical practices like yoga and dancing is a very common thing in all societies, and it helps us to deal in a communal way with traumatic experiences.
Hmm.
Um, but the disembodiment as a phenomenon of alienation, becoming alienated from your own body in a traumatic experience. And you might know where, I'm going with this, referencing alienation, because um, we have been alienated from our nature in Western societies, and that has spiritual meaning and economic meaning in the sense of what we do, the way we relate to nature. It wasn't really any mistake that Marx wrote about the alienation of man from his purpose in nature and his human nature in the process of the Industrial Revolution. And so that goes back to like that reassessment of our relationship to nature and what we're doing on this planet. Like, are we just existing to produce things, to accumulate money, to churn through resources?
I mean,
Um,
it's a fascinating conversation that this kind of leads into. I'm trying desperately not to take the bait, but it's just
well, well, I
it's
don't. Yeah, it's. See, I don't even see it as necessary to make it into an economic thing in the
no,
sense
not
of like,
necessarily like economic, but just like the idea of of what all of this will catalyze, like what society will look like after this change, because it is so inevitable. Because it's not just climate that we've seen this on, right? Like we've seen this on the fact that over the course of the uh, well 20th and now into the 21st century, how our disconnect from nature has caused this lifestyle of office working and minimal
mhm.
movement and eating processed food and not taking care of your mental health because we have disconnect from society and all of these things that like capitalism has essentially capitalized. And now, again, take climate change completely out of the conversation. And we've essentially learned that in order to be healthy, happy human beings, we need to get some fresh air. Whoa, apparently my watch knew what I was talking about. But they've realized like we need to exercise, we need to be outdoors, we need to eat whole foods, we need to be connected to other
Mhm.
people. Like even if you look at so I'm in that stage of life now where everybody around me is having babies and I know way too much about pregnancy and giving birth than I ever wanted to know. But what I have realized is even the way that like our medicine is geared towards like birth and pregnancy and maternal care and like early stage child development and child health care, none of it is in line with like the natural way of doing things. It's all very intervention based and all like based on medicine. And now we're learning that this is not an optimum way to grow a human being. So it's not even just that like it's changing on the climate side where we're realizing that we need to start honoring the fact that like as a species we thrive in a certain environment, and that environment is very closely linked to nature. And that's the bait I was trying to not take because I'm just like I could tell it's just so fascinating to me like what is coming because
Well, yeah. I
there's
can I,
no it's coming like it's coming.
I can bring it back to very practical examples in a sense of like what you mentioned earlier about the experience of Europe during the plague, I think is quite it's another point of empathy that you can take in understanding this, right? Like we have developed an attitude to nature that is, and you see it in all these phenomena that we do of insulating ourselves from nature, blocking it out, making it as safe as possible for us, and um, alienating ourselves from it, removing ourselves from it, and fooling ourselves as that we are humans and not animals, and that we are somehow
Yeah.
different in a way. And that is all coming to fruition in us seeing that actually, oh, well, no, we don't have that much control over the climate and what it can do to us now. So, coming back to practical actions about the way we live and eat and act that recognize that we are still animals and we need these types of connections to and exposures to the environment. You can see it in like all the new kind of health movements that are coming up, like cold water exposure and mushroom foraging and going
Yeah.
hunting and these sort of things. Um, like it's being reminded that we are humans and we're a part of this system is really, I think it can be very powerful for people to kind of just to reassess what we're doing and what impact we're having.
Yeah, I definitely think so. I do wonder to some extent like how much the pandemic has kind of brought us back to that, because despite the fact, obviously, it goes without saying that the pandemic has been absolutely awful. Like, it's, in no way am I trying to make it sound like it's been anything other than awful. But there have been some outcomes from it that I think have been like positive in what they are. And one of those really is around this idea of like empathy and kindness and kind of considering people, and specifically around trying to consider and be more vocal about one's mental health. You see a lot of companies that are doing like wellness days and things like that. And I think, I don't know, maybe a note to wrap up on, thinking about like everybody has mental health, like, and they say it all the time, like, you have physical health, you have mental health. These are two inalienable things about you as a person. So speaking to people about it, rather, it is, and it doesn't have to be about the climate, right? It can just be like, I'm feeling anxious about something today, like, talk to me about it. A practice that I probably the single most helpful practice that I find in managing anxiety is somehow getting it out of my body. Either I write it down, or I'll say it out loud, or I'll tell someone about it. Because 99% of the time after I've done that, I'm like, oh, it's not so bad. Okay, we're fine. Let's just reassess this and, stop freaking out. And I'm not saying like everyone's experience will be like that, but sometimes you just need to speak to somebody. And I'm sure that there are, there are loads of people within this community who kind of feel the same way and are happy to connect. Um, Say something, Alex. I just kind of like wrapped up there by myself.
No,
I didn't mean to.
well, it just reminded me that again, like the what do you call it? The symptoms of these things not always going to be obviously related to climate change.
Mm-mm.
Like they can show up in many other ways. So yeah, developing see the spirit of not doing this alone and doing it through community action is all based on connecting with other people. And empathy is the key tool for connecting with other people and building a shared respect for other people around you as humans. So it doesn't have you don't have to connect, like you said, you don't have to connect with people or start a conversation about climate change even. You could actually probably have a greater long-term subtle impact on someone by becoming close to them and having a good bond with them before you ever bring up climate change. Because then once you do have a conversation with them, I mean, this is if you're trying to, like share your thoughts and beliefs about things, but um, with connection, you have a lot more understanding and a lot more ability to change the direction of someone else's actions. So yeah, I think, as you said, like now I'm stuck with the last word.
Well, Alex, thank you so much, so much for joining us. This has been a really cool conversation, and I'm sure we could go for much, much longer. But to kind of spare you that, thank you for joining us. Thank you to anyone who listened. Rux, thanks for organizing. She's our tech fairy in the background, and who is on our podcast if you want to hear from her. So thanks very much, Alex.
Thanks, Keran.